Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic is the second half of Lecture 23, Slavery Under Attack. Now, as always, take a moment, get down the rest of the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms. Now, with that, let's get started. Now, we left off talking about how slavery was under attack both from within, slave revolts and conspiracies of revolts, and from without, the beginnings of the abolitionist movement in the North, led in part by William Lloyd Garrison, his Anti-Slavery Society, and of course the first-hand accounts of people like Frederick Douglass, and of course Sojourner Truth. Now, I noted at the end of the lecture, though, that things really began following that strategy of the Second Great Awakening. They were convinced of this moral evil, this sinful nature, this institution of slavery. They began producing tracts and pamphlets to educate the public about it. And people in the North and South reacted very strongly either for or against this propaganda. So let's start here in the South. In the South, in 1835 alone, just 1 year, abolitionists mailed more than 1 million pieces of anti-slavery literature to the South. This tactic drew enormous backlash. Southern legislatures banned abolitionist literature. They encouraged the harassment and abuse of anyone distributing it. So if you're personally handing it out, harass them, beat them. And began to look the other way when pro-slavery mobs seized the mail and burned it. Think about this for a minute. Isn't this a violation of the First Amendment rights of freedom of speech? And if you're tampering with the mail service, that's a federal offense. That's a crime. And yet, Southern legislatures, local officials began to look the other way and even encourage it. And then things got worse, especially for the slaves themselves, because the majority of Southern states began enacting tougher laws regarding emancipation of slaves. Began enacting tougher laws restricting the freedom of movement for slaves, and in general all aspects of slave behavior, limiting to the amount of people that can gather in one space without having whites present, for instance. And so in the South, the immediate impact of abolitionist efforts in the North was actually to make the lives of slaves harder. But even in the North, things were not exactly, hunky-dory, if you will. Because while abolitionist was more common to talk about, it often drew tremendous controversy. When these abolitionists began to hold large meetings, similar to revivals of the Second Great Awakening, this opened the door to mob action in the North. Crowds of people would disrupt these meetings. Garrison, for example, William Lloyd Garrison himself, he was once stoned, dragged through the street, and at one occasion actually almost hanged by a Boston mob. The only thing that saved him from being hung was that he was thrown in jail. Yeah, he was thrown in jail to prevent being hung. And again, Garrison's treatment was not unusual. Most Northerners did not really support the abolitionist movement. Now, they didn't want slavery, but it was not over some moral, altruistic ideas. Rather, it was what's called the NIMBY principle, not in my backyard. In other words, we're against slavery if it's in my backyard, but if you do it in my neighbor's yard, I don't really care. In this case, the neighbor's yard was the South. And the reason they're okay with it in the South is it didn't really impact them. What they were afraid is that if you allow slavery in the North, these wage workers in these northern industries, textiles, remember Lowell, that these wage workers and factories will have to compete not just with each other or immigrants who are lowering the cost of wages. They would have to compete against free labor of slaves, thus lowering wages even further. And so they're not doing it out of some altruistic moral reason. They're doing it on purely selfish economic reasons. They don't want slavery, but it's okay, keep it where it's at, just don't let slavery come here. So on the one hand, there's that group of Northerners. On the other hand, there were Northerners, however, who were inspired by people like William Lloyd Garrison. One such man was the Elijah Lovejoy. It's a fascinating story here. First of all, he's a minister. He was also a printer from New England. In the 1830s, he decides to move from New England to the West, Illinois, right on the banks of the Mississippi River. And once he reaches there, he begins to set up his shop, his printing shop, and begins to print abolitionist material. Of course, I hope you all know, it's fairly close to Missouri, which is a slave state, because Illinois and the Mississippi River is the boundary between Illinois and Missouri. And unfortunately for Elijah Lovejoy, his neighbors were not too fond of him printing abolitionist material. And so in 1837, a white mob, after having a few drinks to get some liquid courage, they broke into his shop and they kind of busted up his printing press a little bit. Next morning, Elijah Lovejoy comes in, looks around, and says, I didn't know there were this big of rats in Illinois. He put the machine back together. He began printing abolitionist tracts again. So his neighbors look around like, dude, you're not getting the image here, not getting the picture here. And so about a week later, they break in again after a few drinks. This time they disassemble his printing press. And they leave it in pieces. Surely this time, Elijah Lovejoy will get the message. Next morning, Elijah Lovejoy comes in, looks around, and says, wow, those rats got skill. They can take apart machines. So Elijah Lovejoy looks around. All the parts are there, puts the printing press back together, and begins printing abolitionist literature again. So the neighbors are getting mad by this point. They get together again, have a few more drinks for liquid courage. They break in a third time. This time they take apart the machine, take it outside, and dump it in Elijah Lovejoy's front yard. Elijah Lovejoy gets the next morning, looks around, and says, wow, those rats be strong. He gathers up his stuff, takes it back into his shop, reassembles his machine, and once again prints abolitionist literature. Now his neighbors are pissed. They break in a fourth time. This time they disassemble the machine, carry it outside, and dump it in the Mississippi River. Next morning, Elijah Lovejoy gets there, looks for her stuff, can't quite find it, but sees this little breadcrumb trail of machine parts that lead down to the river. He goes down the river, he fishes out everything he can find, puts it all back together, and realizes he's missing a few parts. So he writes a letter back to his friends back in New England and says, hey guys, I got a rat problem out here. Can you send me a few missing parts? They kind of damaged my machine. Oh, and while you're at it, these are some pretty big rats. Send me some shotgun shells along with it. So, in December 1837, he gets his new parts. He puts his machine back together and once again begins printing abolitionist material. His neighbors are livid by this point. They can't believe this guy. He won't give up. He's uncompromising. And so they break in for a fifth time on December 7th, 1837. Only this time when they break in with a little liquid courage, this time Elijah Lovejoy is sitting there with his gun in his hand, aimed right at the men. The men look at each other, oh, sorry, guy. Oh, this is your place? I'm sorry. We thought it was the neighbor's place. Hey, where are we going now? So they leave, go outside, they surround the house, and proceed to light the house on fire with Elijah Lovejoy in it. Now, eventually Elijah Lovejoy has a decision to make. Do you stay in the house and be burned to death? Or do you obviously leave the house and run outside? Well, Elijah Lovejoy runs outside, and when he runs outside, his neighbors shoot him dead. He's gunned down by his neighbors because Elijah Lovejoy was trying to protect his property and his First Amendment rights. Now, please note before I go on, Elijah Lovejoy did not believe they were rats. I just do that for effect. Just make a note of that. Now, Elijah Lovejoy has a unique position in history. He becomes a martyr and in many respects is the first white man to die for the abolitionist effort to end the enslavement of other human beings. But he also becomes a noble martyr in the sense that, while most Northerners really didn't care about slavery, in other words, they didn't want in their backyard, but they didn't really care about the morality of it. They did care about their constitutional rights. They cared about freedom of speech, freedom of the press. They cared about personal property. And so while most Northerners, statistically, were not interested in the abolitionist effort, they did, however, rally behind the martyrdom of Elijah Lovejoy. Because Elijah Lovejoy was a man who was trying to stand up for his First Amendment rights of freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and to protect his private personal property that was burned to the ground thanks to this white mob. And so it actually caused exponential growth of Northern whites to the abolitionist cause, not over moral hatred or moral apportion of slavery, but over the right of people to, well, use the First Amendment and protect private property. And so this moral suasion ultimately works and will gather large numbers of people to their cause in the North. So step one, Second Great Awakening, moral suasion. Convince people it's immoral or it's an evil, it's sinful. Well, between the Anti-Slavery Society, the Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, now Elijah Lovejoy, it's worked. People are convinced this is a moral, sinful thing. Next, you move to political action. Change the law that you want to get rid of, or change the sinful nature, sinful act. And so move to political action. So, following Elijah Lovejoy's martyrdom, massive abolition petition drives began to be sent to the White House, to Washington, D.C. In fact, in the early 1730s, more than 700,000 petitions requesting the abolition of slavery, or at least the abolition of slavery and the slave trade in Washington, D.C. So some of these abolitions didn't start big. Like, they didn't say, we're going to end slavery in the entire country. No. They wanted to focus on the nation's capital. They said, how is it that we proclaim ourselves the land of the free, the home of the brave, but yet we have both slavery and a slave trade, slave auctions, in the nation's capital of Washington, D.C.? And Washington, D.C. is a unique case study because it's not a state. It's the District of Columbia. It's, common ground for all states. And if Washington, D.C. allows slavery, doesn't that mean that the government supports it? Again, it's a worthy question to be asked. Unfortunately, this petition drive fails. Because even though these abolitionists were no longer trying to change things in the South, they were trying to just focus their energy on just the nation's capital. But as a result of this flood in the 1830s of these abolitionist petitions to Congress, Southern congressmen moved to silence the abolitionist political influence. At the Southern insistence, President Andrew Jackson's approval, Congress will in 1836 pass what's called the gag rule. Yes, Andrew Jackson supported this, Southern slave owners wanted this, and Congress passed in 1836 the gag rule that prohibited the discussion of anti-slavery petitions. Whoa! What? Congress in 1836 passed the gag rule. They would not even discuss anything regarding these anti-slavery petitions. Now, of course, Northerners view this as censorship of the mail. First Amendment rights, that's a felony if you mess with the tamper the mail service. South saw this as necessary to defend against the abolitionist frenzy. And what's really fascinating about this, if you look at the top right corner of the slide, you may not know who that man is. That's John Quincy Adams. Remember him? The man who beat Andrew Jackson in 1824 and lost to him in 1828. John Quincy Adams, who's, by the way, of note, the only former president to serve in Congress after being president, he will decry and denounce the gag rule as a violation of the Constitution and the constitutional right to petition. But it will take 8 years for the gag rule to be lifted. So the gag rule is in effect from 1836 all the way to 1844. And as a result of this, this begins to cause a split in the movement. Because Northerners who are, again, this gag rule has an unintended consequence, right? Because while on the one hand, yeah, it does stifle federal legislation, it actually galvanizes support in the North because those Northern workers who would otherwise not really care about slavery and quite frankly do not want blacks living next to them or competing for the same job, they will, however, become outraged over censorship, over this violation of the Constitution right to petition, over William Lloyd Garrison, over Elijah Lovejoy. All these things seem proof that there's this evil slave power that's threatening democracy in America. And as we move into the 1850s, it'll become the dominant political issue. And so we start seeing a crisis on our democracy here. Because we see Southern slave owners. Remember, they only represent 25% of the population of the South. Even smaller percentage of total white population in the entire country. And yet these small percent of slave owners are essentially dictating politics, ushering in a gag rule to not even discuss legislation. This is a crisis of democracy. That's only going to get worse in the 1850s, and we'll discuss in our next lecture. But one of the things the South did here in response to all this abolitionist attack was to try to redefine slavery. In other words, for the longest time, slavery was just like, oh, well, we didn't start slavery, but slavery's always existed. It's just a necessary evil. But in the 1840s, late 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, in response to all this abolitionist propaganda, the South began to say, well, it's no longer just a necessary evil. No. It's actually a positive good. In fact, slaves, basically, these are children, right? African Americans are children. They're subhuman. And therefore, it is our job to, take care of them and raise them up to a level of civility, right? It's a positive. We take care of our slaves from cradle to grave. And they outlined a number of reasons why slavery was a positive good. Again, there are a number of them. I'm going to go through a few of them. The first one was biblical. Now, part of this biblical justification was going back to that Hamitic principle we talked about before, where Noah had 3 sons and Ham was cursed, and supposedly he was the father of all African people, i.e. black. But they went one step further from the Old and New Testament admonitions for servants to obey their masters. In fact, Paul does write, hey, you're a slave, don't seek to be free, just do your best and be a slave. And they're basically saying that if you look throughout history, even in the Bible, every great civilization had slaves, and they depend on it. Therefore, why should we not depend on it? So first was that biblical definition. The second positive good definition, redefinition of slavery, came a legal definition. And the legal justification rested on the Constitution's refusal to forbid slavery. They said, hey, our founding fathers were great men, and they did not get rid of slavery in the Constitution, therefore it must be good. And yet, when it did talk about slavery, i.e. the Three-Fifths Compromise, the protection of the international slave trade for 20 years, of course then, the third thing that mentioned about slavery in the framing of the Constitution, the compromise, was the Fugitive Slave Act that said, hey, if you are a slave in one state and run away, it is the job of the other state to return that slave to their master. Fugitive Slave Act. And therefore, the Founding Fathers agreed then that slavery was good for our country. Three-Fifths Compromise, the not banning the slave trade, and the Fugitive Slave Act that mandated that slaves be returned to their master if they are caught running away. So there's a biblical definition, justification. There's the legal justification. The third one was a scientific justification. And they begin to argue through pseudoscience. This is still social Darwinism. But they begin to argue that blacks had been created separately as an inherently inferior race. And therefore, it was their destiny to serve the superior white masters. Slave owners even convinced themselves that it was their job to educate, that the educated master was the African's best friend, to just kind of show him the right way to live civilized. And of course, they did things like measure skull sizes and so forth, trying to have these pseudoscience ways of saying that, well, Africans were a lower subspecies of human. They weren't fully evolved yet. And then there was the next justification, the fourth justification, which was the slave versus what Southerners called wage slaves. You see, Southerners argue that slaves had it better than the poor factory workers of the North, that they called wage slaves. You see, what happened was masters supposedly took care of their slaves from cradle to grave, right? Well, if you're a factory worker, wage worker in the North, and you get sick, do you get paid? I mean, think about now. I mean, if you don't go to work, you don't get paid. And so they argued, Southerners did, that Southern slaves were far better off than those wage slaves, hourly workers in the North, because they took care of them from cradle to grave in sickness and in health and kept them alive, whereas the wage slaves, hourly workers of the North, well, they're at the mercy of how long they can work based on their health, and when they're too old to work, they're discarded. In fact, they went so far as to say emancipation, therefore, Southern slave owners did, would be heartless and cruel and unthinkable, a burden to Africans, because they would not know how to take care of themselves. By the same time as all these justifications, the elite white slave owners had to frame everything and take into account that 75% of white families didn't own slaves, but yet envied those who did. And so to deflect potential for class antagonism among whites themselves, wealthy planners developed a justification of slavery that pictured all whites as superior to black, but yet equal to one another. So there was supposedly democratic equality among whites, i.e. they could all vote. That they were all, at least they were white, so at least they're not black. And so this idea of white supremacy became the social construct that allowed that the fact that 75% of whites did not own slaves, it allows some form of camaraderie and democratic equality between whites in the South to at least, even if you're a poor white who's barely making a living, barely not starving to death, at least you're not black. And as a result of all these things, and a result of the abolitionist movement, the South begins to, again, harden the institution of slavery, making it harder, making it illegal in some respects for Southern slave owners to actually emancipate their slaves. They also tried to pass laws that forbade the distribution of anti-slavery material. Now, one of the problems was, though, that anti-slavery propaganda was being produced still. And so they began to pass laws that forbade the teaching of slaves to read and write. In other words, keep them illiterate. The argument being that if a slave's illiterate, even if an anti-slavery abolitionist tract does arrive, the slave won't be able to read it anyway. And so estimates show that only 5% of the 4 million slaves in 1860 could actually read and write, which is a far small number that's going to greatly impact African Americans once they do achieve their freedom. But what all of these things coalesce to, the underlying but rarely admitted motive behind all these justifications, was that slavery was profitable. As the Southern defense of slavery intensified in the 1840s and 1850s, they tried social justifications, they tried biblical, legal, etc. The underlying truth was it was profitable. And therefore, they were determined to keep it in the face of all obstacles, in the face of mounting pressure during the 1850s and 1860s. And we'll talk more about that in the coming lectures. But until then, take care and bye-bye.